What's up, book nerds? It's Kirsten and welcome back to my channel. It has been a hot flippin' minute. Life got pretty busy, and while producing content here did take a bit of a backseat, something that didn't get deprioritized for me was reading. I read 123 books in the year of 2018. My Goodreads reading goal was set at 52. I thought, you know, if I could read one book a week throughout the entire year, I would be really happy with that. I'd be proud of that. But I didn't take into account that I would be in my car 2 hours a day driving to and from work, and that I would also end up being able to listen to audiobooks while working. And so I ended up just flying right past my reading goal and demolishing like a huge part of my old TBR, as well as some books that I was excited to come out this year. However, having such a successful reading year is actually just going to end up making this video even harder to make. I have to choose 18 of my favorite books out of 123, and I've ended up really enjoying almost all of the books that I've read this year. I gave really good ratings to most of them. I ended up being really lucky and only picking up books that I ended up very much enjoying. However, that is just making this video so much harder. I'm not positive about what's going to be happening with the lighting. It's kind of cloudy out, and like we keep getting some light and some clouds, but I haven't seen the sun, so it might end up being kind of weird, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens. Also, I'm hoping I don't lose my voice halfway through this video. I do have my tea waiting for me, and I just am going to plug away at it and hope for the absolute best, because it has been too long already since I made a video, and I didn't need any more reasons not to make this one. For this video, I am going to be exclusively focusing on books that were published in 2019 or before. In the second half of the year, I ended up receiving, reading, and loving a handful of ARCs for 2019. However, I am going to leave those to talk about in the new year. But since this video is already going to be long enough and editing it is going to be enough of a pain in the ass as it is, I'm just gonna jump right into the books. So my top 18 of 2018 is as follows. I don't have this organized in any set way. It is very loosely going to be done in the order that I read them in. However, if I read multiple books in a series, I'm only going to count that as one spot. So they might not all be in the order that I read them in, and they're definitely not in any sort of like least to most favorite or most to least favorite. These are just 18 of the stories that I enjoyed the most within the year. Kicking off this video is something that I am sure none of you will be surprised with, and that is the Wayward Children series by Seanan McGuire. I ended up reading Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire as my first read of 2018, and I really enjoyed it, and then had to catch up on books 2 and 3 when I was approved for the ARC for book 4 that doesn't out until 2019. I ended up very much enjoying books 1, 2, and 3. I don't have the physical copy of the third yet, as I ended up listening to it on audiobook, but I will end up getting it because I love them so much. These are really great adventure stories. They're portal fantasies that bounce between different characters, and they have a different story for each book, but we kind of follow this same set of characters as they go through a bunch of these adventures. I think out of the 3 that have been published already, my favorite was the second, which is Down Among the Sticks and Bones. It was definitely the darkest, but also just really liked the characters quite a bit more and the atmosphere. But these were a mind-blowing series that I totally suggest to anybody who is a fan of those big, complicated fantasy worlds. Seanan McGuire, in such a small amount of words, is able to build the most amazing magical worlds, and I would highly suggest these to anybody who enjoys portal fantasies. These books are about adventure and friendship and finding yourself and proving yourself, and I just enjoyed them so much. Next up is another one that I am sure nobody is going to be surprised by, and that is The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas. I know that this was included in a lot of people's favorites of 2017, but I initially held off on reading it until I knew that I was in a good enough place where I could read this heavy of content without having to like put it down and stretch it out over a week and be sad for like the entire time that I was reading it. It was absolutely everything that anybody has said it is. If you're watching this, I am sure you've already heard 1,001 reviews about this book, and it lived up to every single one of them. If you haven't read this book yet, if you're holding off for some sort of reason, I highly suggest picking it up because it will live up to all of your expectations. The next book, if this was in a least to most favorite, would be very close to the absolute top spot. It's a book that I enjoyed so incredibly much, and I have been talking about on my Bookstagram all year, and that book is Cat and Meg Conquer the World by by Anna Primazza. This book revolves around two teen girls who become friends. Kat has an anxiety disorder and her family moves across the country to be closer to her sick grandfather, and Meg has ADHD and she is struggling with creating lasting friendships while navigating her illness. This is an own voices story for anxiety rep. Even though the ADHD rep isn't own voices, it was incredibly well done. It was well researched and thought out and just so on point. I ended up enjoying it so much. If you've seen my previous videos, you probably know that I have a fairly severe case of ADHD, and I ended up identifying so much with Meg and just loving all of the struggles that she's going through. Meg is also a Black teen, which is just even more representation to love in this story. I really loved this friendship between these two girls. Both of our main characters are these nerdy girls, and they end up being able to bond over their mutual appreciation for this online gamer. They get to go on this nerdy adventure of crossing back to the other side of Canada to go to this gaming convention, and the entire adventure is just so much fun, and the friendship is just so wholesome, and I am here for girls supporting girls and all of these strong female friendships. Next up is another series that I ended up binging this year, and that is the Witchland series by Susan Dennard. I ended up reading Truth Witch and Wind Witch, and then receiving and reading the ARC for Sight Witch. I have also already purchased a hardcover copy of Sight Witch because I'm going to need this entire series on my shelves because I've loved them so much, but it hasn't actually arrived yet. So many people describe this series as being similar to the Avatar series, and I highly support that. It's this sort of magic system that is based in different witches having different sort of powers. I absolutely love these characters, and I am just so impatient to see where the story goes. These characters are all just suffering so much, and they deserve such good things, and I am just so highly anticipating seeing where the rest of the series goes. But if you haven't picked it up yet, then I highly suggest giving them a try. However, if really heavy world building is something that you sometimes struggle with, I would actually suggest either like using page flags or taking a couple notes as you read, because I did end up getting lost a couple of times in the rules of the magic system and of the different terms that different sorts of like witches have. But I really only have amazing things to say about this series, so I would highly suggest them. And then we have Renegades by Marissa Meyer. Now, before anybody gets nervous or anything, being like, oh, why isn't she talking about Renegades and Arch Enemies? I haven't read Arch Enemies. I have it, I bought it, but I haven't read it yet, mostly because the end of the year has been dedicated to catching up on the Shadowhunter Chronicle books. However, I loved Renegades, and Arch Enemies was one of my most highly anticipated releases of the year. I am so excited to get to the second book, but I will have to wait for 2019. Renegades is this really amazing sort of superhero story. However, most of our point of view ends up being told from who would be conventionally known as the villain's side of the story. However, the entire plot line is just so much more complicated than good guys versus bad guys. It is so drenched in like political intrigue and what's right and wrong. And I honestly don't think that you need to be a fan of superheroes to end up really enjoying this story. It's just so political, and it's this set of characters trying to navigate what they think is right and what they know is wrong, all while sort of juggling their own convictions and motivations. But it's really complicated and amazing, and I would highly suggest it to anybody who hasn't picked it up. However, I am sure most of you have, because it is such a hyped novel. And then we have Furthermore and Witchwood by Tahira Mafi. These books were absolutely stunning. I love them so incredibly much. They are technically a middle grade series. However, they handle such like strong, heavy emotional topics that even though they are technically middle grade, I honestly don't think that you need to be in middle grade to enjoy them. They could be easily appreciated by young adults and grandparents and children. Literally anybody could fall in love with these books. Tahira Mafi's writing is just so lyrical and beautiful that reading her describe these fantasy worlds is almost like reading poetry. Furthermore is almost very flowery and pretty, even though we're taking on this sort of heavy topic of our main character looking for her lost father in a new world that she's never experienced before. So even though they end up going to darker places and taking on darker themes and darker problems, the book itself always feels really beautiful and bright, and I ended up loving it so much, and so I was so excited to end up picking up Witchwood this year. It was one of my most highly anticipated releases of the year, and it is told from a new perspective with a new main character in a different part of the world, but it's still in the same universe as Furthermore, and we do end up still seeing our protagonists from Furthermore in Witchwood. I was so shocked with how dark the second book ended up being. It was scary and creepy and emotional, and we followed such heavier topics. This really revolves around loneliness and death and what is owed to the dead, and we really feel the struggle of our main character having to meet expectations, and the expectations that her family has put on her and the expectations that she has for herself as well. She is struggling with how much has been put on her shoulders, and we really get to feel how emotional that is. But both of these books are just so beautiful and atmospheric. I could not possibly pick a favorite between the two, but I did especially love the way that in the second we really get to see our protagonist. We get to feel as she like opens herself up and learns to trust people and make friends, and that was something that I thought was really truly beautiful. And then we have They Both Die at the End by Adam Silvera. I had already read all of Becky Albertalli's books before What If It's Us came out, and so I wanted to try to catch up on Adam's books before I ended up reading the book that they wrote together. And so I picked this one up because it was really hyped and everybody was talking about it and everybody seemed to be loving it, and it broke me. This book broke me. I remember I was bouncing back and forth between the physical copy and the audiobook while I was reading it, because I just could not put it down, but I needed to like do adult things like go to work and like clean my house. So when I couldn't possibly be reading the physical copy, I was listening to the audiobook, and I remember I finished it while driving home from work. And so I was on the highway like close to midnight. It was dark and I was driving and I was alone and there was no other cars around, and I was just weeping. I was full on sobbing. This book will challenge everything that you think that you know about so many things, and it was just so good and so emotional, and I just love these characters so much. And Adam Silvera is kind of a monster. I love him, but he's a monster. I think we can all agree on that, right? I think we can. Yeah, I'm pretty sure. Oh, a puppy. Oh, look at the pupper. Wait, one sec. Look, look, there's the puppy. Oh, look at the pupper. He's such a little teddy bear. He does have a human, by the way. I know you can't see his human. His human is just down there kind of by the trees. How am I supposed to make quality content when there's puppers here to distract me? But yes, They Both Die at the End. You are not ready. If you haven't read this book, the only thing that I can tell you is that you are not ready for it, and you'll never be ready for it, so you may as well just read it now and be emotional with the rest of us. Next, we have The Cruel Prince by Holly Black. I don't know why I was so hesitant to pick this book up. It was so hyped and everybody was talking about it, but I was just so nervous to read it, even though I had read and loved some of Holly Black's books in the past. But I'm just so finicky, I think is probably the right word, when it comes to these sort of fairy tale stories. And it's honestly just because I have loved fairy tale stories for as long as I've been reading, even though like Holly Black is known as the fairy queen. Like there is no reason for me to have been nervous, but for some reason I was, and I shouldn't have been. This book lived up to 110% of my expectations and gave me even more than I was hoping for. It was so incredibly good. In case you haven't read it, we focus in this book on our main character, Jude, who is this strong sort of female badass character who wishes that she could be a knight in the fairy court. Jude is fully human, but she was taken into this fairy realm when her adoptive father, who is her oldest sister's biological father, killed their mother. I am also going to mention The Lost Sisters, which is just a tiny little novella that is set between this and The Wicked King, which is the sequel that is coming out in the beginning of 2019. Spoiler alert, I read the arc and loved it. The Cruel Prince is just this really high stakes sort of story that revolves around these really complex characters, and I loved it so much. And then The Lost Sisters, which is very short, is a letter written to Jude from her twin sister, which to me really ended up saving her character. I really didn't like her as a character, which is like honestly probably like you're not supposed to like her, but then reading the letter from her perspective to her sister, explaining and not technically apologizing, however, at least giving justification to some of her actions, really ended up saving her as a character for me, and I was so glad that I had that knowledge before I ended up reading The Wicked King. But this is an absolutely incredible fairy tale story that I ended up enjoying so much. I love that I couldn't guess what was going to happen or whose motivations are what, and I absolutely suggest this to anybody who for some reason, like me, was holding off on reading them, because they are amazing. They're so good. This and The Lost Sisters were both incredible, and I highly suggest anybody read them so that you can read The Wicked King when it comes out and suffer with the rest of us. Holly Black loves to torture us with these books. She does. I know she does. Somewhere, wherever she is right now, she's smiling evilly, knowing that she is torturing all of her readers. And then we have Daughter of the Burning City by Amanda Foody. It's a YA fantasy that is told in this sort of circus environment, and I just loved it so much. I have already talked about it in my mid-year book tag, so if you want to hear a little bit more about it, because I did enjoy it so much, I don't want to end up talking about it because it'll just be like 20 minutes later and I'll still be talking about this one book. But the fantasy was amazing, the representation was amazing, and I just loved this sort of dark circus environment. This was, I believe, Amanda Foody's debut novel, and it was already guaranteed after reading this that I would read anything that she writes for the rest of my life. She's so good, and these fantasy universes that she creates are just so developed, and I loved falling into them. And then I read Ace of Shades by Amanda Foody, further just driving home the fact that I will instantly read anything that she writes. It was just, I loved Daughter of the Burning City so much that I wasn't even finished reading it before I ended up ordering this. Ace of Shades is just another sort of twisted fantasy world that I ended up loving this year, which is definitely looking like a theme for my reading year of 2018. I don't know what that says about my year, but I have really loved these dark, twisted fantasy worlds. But Ace of Shades, we follow our main character, N, as she travels to this sort of Las Vegas meets Nocturne Alley sort of city. While she was definitely raised more like a lady with manners and class, she ends up having to really just navigate and survive this world that is more focused on gambling and lying and all of these dark, guilty pleasures that she's never really had to experience before. She meets Levi, who has his own set of complicated motivations, and together they go on this adventure just trying to survive, looking for N's mom. It was such a good read. I loved it so much, and both of Amanda Foody's books I read as a part of my Pride Month book tag, as both of them have LGBT representation. If I'm not mistaken, as it has been a little bit, so I might be a little bit foggy, Daughter of the Burning City has asexual demi-romantic rep. Ace of Shades has a bisexual main character, if I'm not mistaken. I hope I didn't just mix those two up. My next book is another one that I ended up listening to on audio and absolutely adoring. It was another of my most highly anticipated releases of the year, and that book is Daughter of the Siren Queen, which was the sequel to Daughter of the Pirate King by Trisha Levenseller. This was just such a good story. I ended up enjoying it so much. I loved the first book and knew I was going to love the second. It was one of my most highly anticipated releases of the year. Both of these books revolve around our main character, who is, as you may have guessed, the daughter of the Pirate King and the Siren Queen. She's this awesome, badass female character who still enjoys dresses while stabbing people. I always end up really enjoying these female characters that can be both badass and feminine. You end up seeing so often in young adult literature when a female character is going to be like kick-ass and strong and like to fight and like kill people and whatever, that she's also hating more feminine things like, you know, makeup and pink and whatever. But our main character, Princess Aloza, she is such a great sort of well-developed character who loves dresses and stabbing people, which is just something that I enjoyed so much. One of my favorite like sort of opinions on this book is actually the little blurb on the top, which is from Anna Banks, and it said, "Readers should rejoice because we now have a Lady Jack Sparrow on our hands." And that was honestly the perfect way to describe Aloza. She is just such a, you can't really say like unlovable character because you love her, but in the way that Jack Sparrow is unlovable but also very well beloved, you know? Like, she makes some terrible decisions and she has some terrible motivations, but you're definitely rooting for her 110% of the time of this book. I absolutely loved it. It was such a great adventure. And then we have Children of Blood and Bone by Tomi Adeyemi. This book, you guys! Oh, this book! Everything that you have heard about this book, and I'm sure that has been quite a lot because it's a very hyped fantasy YA novel that has been all over social media. Everything that you have heard about it is absolutely worth it. This is such a great story. It was so good. I loved it so much. I don't know how to possibly describe everything that happens in this book without spoilers and without making this video 5 hours long because it was just so detailed and there was just so much to this story. Look at the physical book, it's pretty too. This is most certainly an amazing example of a fantasy world that uses fantasy to teach us a lesson about our own world. It mirrors so well into what our society is currently struggling with. In this book, we experience the struggles that an entire population of victims experiences after having their power taken away by the government. It is heartbreakingly relevant, and I absolutely suggest it to anybody, whether you enjoy fantasy or not. The world was amazing and the magic system is absolutely stunning. This entire book is just flawless. I can't wait for the sequel. Tomi Adeyemi is definitely going to be one of these absolute fantasy queens of our generation, and I just loved this book so incredibly much. If you have read this book, then like come talk to me about it, because I loved it so much. Talk to me about any of these books, but if you haven't read it yet, A, why not? B, please do. It's just such a powerful story about struggle and loss and grief and doing what's right even when it's hard, and so I highly suggest it to absolutely anybody who is watching this, because you will not be disappointed. This is an amazing story that's set in an amazing fantasy universe, and I cannot wait for the sequel. Okay, hey book nerds, what's good? It's been about an hour, and so the lighting is probably different. However, I distractedly started rambling about all my faves, and killed my battery. Who's surprised? Because I'm not. So we left off talking about Heretics Anonymous by Katie Henry. I ended up super enjoying this. Heretics Anonymous is a book that revolves firmly around faith, which is something that I'm always sort of nervous to end up picking up. As a non-believer, somebody who does not have any sort of strong faith one way or the other, it always feels as though books are either strongly supportive or like vehemently opposing religion. Neither of these two concepts are something that I'm particularly comfortable with, which is why I find myself often sort of hesitant to pick up books with any kind of religious theme. However, the reviews that I had seen all said that this wasn't a problem with this book. And then after reading it, I totally have to agree. This was a really great, really funny book that's main focus, that's like overarching theme is definitely just acceptance. It's really just about learning to accept yourself and everyone around you, and I absolutely loved it, and the entire thing is done in such a humorous way. In Heretics Anonymous, we have this little friend group, and I don't want to mess it up because it's been a while since I actually read it, so I'm actually going to read it off of my phone. But the little friend group includes an atheist, a feminist, devout Catholic, a gay and Jewish male, a Unitarian, and a polytheist pagan. Each of these characters all have their own distinct personalities and struggles and strengths, and I loved seeing them all bring those distinct characteristics together and form the greatest little friend group. Overall, the book was just so funny, and it had a great message of open-mindedness that was dealt in such a humorous way. I was laughing out loud multiple times while reading this book, and I think that anybody could definitely find something in it to enjoy. Next, we have another book that I read earlier in the year, but only just purchased and hasn't quite arrived yet, and that is Sky in the Deep by Adrienne Young. Now, this book is so hard to talk about without giving away any sort of spoilers. If you are here from my Bookstagram, then you might know that when I post a review, I normally end up posting a quote from the book at the top of the review, and even choosing a quote for my Instagram post without spoiling anything was so difficult. This book was pitched to me as a badass female Viking story, and that was enough to have me intrigued. I was so ready for that. But in fear of giving anything important away, all that I will say about it is that it was a badass, action-packed, and emotional story that revolved around family and love and growth and fighting for what's right. The entire story was just such a 50-50 divide on being like intense, action-packed fight scenes and then like overly emotional, like tug at your heartstrings scenes. It was such a great combination, and it ended up just being such a successful story. And next is a book that I actually hadn't noticed until right now that I haven't bought a published copy of yet, and that is Muse of Nightmares by Laini Taylor. Now that I've realized that I do not have a finished copy on my shelf, I will be rectifying that very quickly. As you can see, I received an arc of Muse of Nightmares. I read and reviewed this story in advance and absolutely adored it. Laini Taylor is a goddess of fantasy writing. I find myself constantly holding her to such an exceedingly high expectation of writing, and she never disappoints. Muse of Nightmares is a sequel, so summing it up is a little bit difficult. I do have a full video reviewing this book that I will have linked down below, where I painted myself blue and talked talked about my time reading this story. But overall, I really loved this. It was an amazing sequel, and I absolutely love this world and these characters. In this book, we pick up right from where the first book ended. It also introduces 2 new characters, and right from the beginning, I was absolutely hooked. If you want to know any of my other thoughts on this book or this series in general, then go ahead and check out my video linked down below. But this is definitely a fantasy story that deserved all of the hype that it got. And then at the end of September, myself and one of my best friends jumped into the car and we drove nearly 12 hours to Seattle to attend a book signing. And that signing was for Vengeful by V.E. Schwab. If you're new here, you may not know that I am absolute Schwab trash. However, I had not read Vicious, and I wanted to catch up because I knew that the signing for this was going to end up talking about this, and I didn't want to be spoiled for the sequel. So next on my top 18 of 2018 is Vicious and Vengeful by Victoria Schwab, both of which I have personalized and signed. These books blew me away. I know I've already said it for all of these other books about how they were like dark and twisty and you don't know where the plot's going and like yada yada yada. But these are the epitome of dark, twisty books. If you, like me, appreciate these like morally ambiguous characters and like impossible odds that you have to like fight really hard to beat, then you would adore these stories. Absolutely highly suggest them. They were so incredibly good. In Vicious, we start with these 2 sort of main characters who are friends in a university type setting. One of them is writing a sort of thesis type paper, doing all this research on the existence of these like superhuman people. The easiest way to sort of describe what these superhuman characters look like is honestly sort of similar to X-Men. They are just these certain individuals within society who are born with different abilities that the rest of the general population does not possess. Neither of the characters in this book could ever possibly be described as a hero. They are both just such unreliable, unlovable, dark characters, but you understand each of their motivations. They're both cruel and devious, and they certainly don't hold back their punches. After performing an experiment, they both end up with these sort of superpowers, neither of them agreeing on what the next move should be, which sets them against each other for the rest of the story. And we don't only follow those 2 male characters either. We end up bouncing between an entire array of characters, spanning between different sexes and ages and abilities. Just this entire story just really encompasses this incredibly angry undertone of feminism and classism and racism. And I just absolutely adored this sort of stick it to the man vibe that you get while reading it. This series is honestly flawless. It's stunning. If you enjoy reading stories about the line between good and evil blurring, then I think you would definitely end up appreciating them. Next, we have The Lady's Guide to Petticoats and Piracy by Mackenzie Lee. This is of course another sequel. It is the second book to The Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue. This sequel just did such an incredible job of weaving in the right amount of the characters that we already loved from the first book, while still absolutely being a new story with this new character. This is Felicity's story, who is an asexual female character who's more interested in medicine and science and proving herself than she is in being a lady or marrying and becoming a mother. At its very core, this book is definitely an adventure story. We follow Felicity while she tries to prove herself in the world of medicine, and when it doesn't go the way that she is hoping, then we see her make impossible decisions in hopes of being recognized as a doctor. This is another great book that includes girls supporting girls and female friendship, and I absolutely suggest it. This book was an excellent example of this thing that I love, where the villain in a story isn't really a character. It's more of an idea or a socially constructed reality that the character has to battle rather than just a villain in a mask. In this book, our set of characters fight misogyny and ableism and sexism and homophobia. They also struggle with addictions and illnesses and discovering yourself. I absolutely love both of the books in this series. I loved Gentleman's Guide to Vice and Virtue, and if you haven't read it, then you definitely should, so that you can read this amazing book. And next up, we have another Tahira Mafi book, which is A Very Large Expanse of Sea. I have not yet bought this book because I am holding out to buy the Target exclusive, which is just waiting for me to make my next trip to the US. The Target exclusive contains 2 bonus chapters from Ocean's perspective, and I need that in my life. This book was just so important. It was definitely something that I think should be required reading in schools. Everybody should be reading it because it has something to teach everybody. In this book, we follow our main character Shirin, who is a Muslim female teen, as she moves to a new school and has to go through the struggles that comes with in the year immediately following 9/11. Shirin battles all sorts of prejudice, all sorts of different comments and racism. She chooses to wear a hijab, which means that she is very obviously visible, being a part of the Muslim community. Her story was just so strong and important, and I think everybody should be reading it. And this book was equal parts cute, summery, contemporary love story with really important themes and like heavy topic matters. Following my comments about Tahira Mafi's writing previously in this contemporary story, I was curious to see the way that her sort of lyrical, poetry sounding beautiful writing would end up transferring into a contemporary world, and it was really, really amazing. And her ability to build these fantasy worlds just so wonderfully transferred over into being able to really bring these important topic matters to life. And the 18th and final book that I have to talk to you guys about today is An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. Okay, did anybody else pick this up not realizing that it was going to be a sci-fi story? I did not realize that this was going to be sci-fi. For some reason, I was expecting a contemporary story and then was just so blown away by this entire concept. Our characters were creative and well-rounded, and it's another great example of how fantasy or sci-fi can perfectly mirror our own reality. In this story, there are these statues or these giant robots that apparently look like Transformers that show up all at once in the middle of the night all around the world. And our main character is one of the first to stumble across one. She goes, gets her friend out of bed in the middle of the night, and they go and they make a video, and the video instantly goes worldwide levels of viral because everybody is curious about these statuesque robot type things that have shown up around the world. In her video, our main character jokingly refers to the one that she found as Carl, and these just become the accepted name of all of the robots. They are the Carls. So even though this book is a sci-fi and it is just them trying to figure out with the rest of their society what these giant robots are. They don't know if they were just some sort of publicity stunt for like a movie that's coming out, or if they are robots, or if they are made and dropped from somewhere else, or if they themselves are like aliens from another planet. But overall, this entire story is about so much more than just that. April May, our protagonist, is this snarky, sarcastic girl, and she starts out feeling a lot like any one of us could feel in this sort of situation. She just feels like a real person. And then we see how internet fame just kind of changes her entire world. She ends up making a lot of really bad decisions that we as readers know are going to lead to terrible consequences, but you can't help but understand why she's making all of the decisions that she makes. And this was just overall a really great story that will have you questioning everything the entire way through. And to close out this video, I have 2 honorable mentions. The first of which is Carry On by Rainbow Rowell. Now, I first read this book in the beginning of last year and absolutely adored it. However, I have reread it 2 more times in the year of 2018, and so while I can't really say it's one of my favorite reads of 2018, as it really was one of my favorite reads even though it was a reread, if you don't know what Carry On is about, then where have you been this entire time? Rainbow Rowell in this book ends up bringing us this amazing chosen one story that is equal parts sort of Harry Potter and Percy Jackson and all of these other stories. She brings it to us in this sort of self-aware way. It is absolutely one of my favorite books of all time, and I really ended up enjoying rereading it this year. And my last honorable mention goes to Lady Midnight and Lord of Shadows. I have been binge reading the Shadowhunter Chronicle books, trying to catch up in order to read Queen of Air and Darkness. The Dark Artifices in general are just such a hyped series, and everybody says that they get even better as the books go along. I used to follow the City of Bones books. I read them every year as they came out when I was a little bit younger, and I did really love them, but I ended up sort of like falling off of the Cassie Clare train, but I was really excited to pick them up and to start again. The final book that I finished in 2018 was Lady Midnight, which I did really enjoy, but probably not enough to kick out one of the other books that I've already talked about today. However, I'm about halfway through Lord of Shadows, and I am absolutely adoring it. I just can't label it as one of my favorite of 2018 since I am actually going to end up finishing it in 2019. But you can fully expect me to be talking about this next year. If you are still here, then thank you so much for sticking with me through this probably way too long video. If you read and loved any of the books that I talked about, then I would love to hear from you. Or you can go ahead and let me know your favorite reads of 2018 or your most anticipated releases for 2019 in the comments down below. I would love to know. But thank you so much for sticking with me, and I will see you soon for a new video. Bye!